take this opportunity to give a few introductions to people joining you today. My name is Mark Patch, he, him. I'm an organizer for visual effects with the International Alliance of Stage Theatrical Employees, IATSE. And I am also coming out of the VFX crew world. I've worked production side visual effects for the better part of the last decade. I started as a PA, and then my last credit was this summer with Nope. I was the associate producer of visual effects. And I'd like to introduce some members of our advisory council. Can I start with Gabby?
Hey, my name is Gabrielle. Any pronouns. I'm a data wrangler, mostly out of Atlanta. I've worked in VFX specifically for about 6, almost 7 years now. I'll pass it off to Maggie.
Hi, my name is Maggie Kreismuth, and any pronouns. I've been working as a visual effects artist for almost 20 years with roots in traditional animation. My engagement with union organizing in visual effects began in 2013 when I wrote an article for IndieWire about what it's like to be a visual effects worker in response to the Life of Pi controversy. I recently joined the VFX Union Advisory Council and have been an active member since December of last year. And I'm going to pass it over to Sean.
We understand.
Well, while Sean gets his audio together, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. Ben Spate, he, him, organizer, also based in Atlanta, where I've been organizing for the past 22 years of my life. It's great to be with y'all. And Sean's going to come back here shortly. And for now, we'll just go ahead and kick it back over to you, Mark.
Great. Well, I'm happy to have everyone here from the Advisory Council, as well as members of the visual effects community, survey respondents, new and rejoining activists. So we would like to present to you the results of the survey, which many of you participated in. You may have seen our press releases. Let me see if Sean, are you able to introduce yourself real quickly before we get into the meeting?
Is any better now with the silly headphones? Fantastic. Sean Ames, visual effects professional now for going on 13 years. I've been involved with the advisory council and various forms of it for the last several years. And yeah, back to Mark for whatever I interrupted him with.
A group of visual effects workers, just like yourselves, employed on film crews throughout the United States, began setting up organic social networks to connect with their peers and discuss their working conditions. Since visual effects is among the only departments engaged in film and television production that does not have a collective bargaining unit or union representation, these workers sought to fill that information void themselves. A survey was launched to try and source and publish information about wage rates, and some of you may have participated in that first iteration. So that initially received hundreds of responses from visual effects crews working directly for major studios. This new iteration, also asking questions about our working conditions, was launched on November 10th, 2022, and was conducted under the auspices of the Entertainment Crew Union, IATSE, for the first time. So this iteration of the survey has grown to encompass workers across the entire visual effects industry in the United States, Canada, and beyond. Now, this is not an academic study. There should be an academic study, but we have created what we believe to be the most comprehensive and cogent snapshot of the visual effects industry that has ever been created. So while initially aimed at helping VFX workers advocate for themselves in negotiations by publicizing this rate information that the producers who hire them are loath to share, the survey now additionally seeks to understand our shared challenges in building a sustainable career in visual effects, as well as to highlight the stark contrast between the non-union visual effects workers' experience and that of our unionized coworkers. who are often unaware that their colleagues, are not offered the same benefits and protections as every other IATSE represented craft on set. Now, these findings paint a picture of an industry in crisis. An overwhelming majority of VFX workers feel that their work is not sustainable in the long term. For VFX workers employed directly by film productions, and it's worth mentioning that, as we all know, the VFX department's budget is generally the biggest single line item of any production's budget. Only 12% of these client-side workers have health insurance, which carries over from job to job. Only 15% report any kind of employer contributions to a retirement fund. On average, 70% of VFX workers report having worked uncompensated overtime hours for their employer. Overall, 75% of VFX workers reported being forced to work through legally mandated meal breaks and rest periods without compensation. The majority of on-set VFX workers reported working in conditions that they felt unsafe in. A further 75% of VFX workers employed by major film studios had no access to any employer-funded training or educational resources. And across the industry, only about 1 in 10 VFX workers felt able to individually negotiate viable solutions to these challenges with their employer. So this isn't just about information sharing. We are pivoting from protest to power. This is about democracy in the workplace. It's about justice. It's about winning union representation this year. Now, how do we collect this information? I think many of you are familiar. We use an online form which required registration via email to ensure unique responses from individual workers. Now, you are all asked a variety of questions regarding your working conditions and wages. The survey ran for approximately 2 months, and the advisory council you see here, as well as myself and Ben, other IATSE staff, have supported outreach through email, social media to help gain participation and advertise, as well as, now that the survey is concluded, we've been engaged in an effort to contact all responders by working volunteers just like yourselves. So you'll see that the data points are broken down into client-side and vendor-side workers. So most of you are probably familiar, but because this information will be publicized, we just want to mention that, generally the visual effects industry is broken down into 2 separate groups of VFX workers, known as the client or production side and the vendor side. So when applicable, we've separated the results based on whether a worker self-identified as working client side or vendor side in order to reflect the differing experiences faced by these different groups of workers. The client side workers are generally employed directly by the film production company, working under the direct supervision and control of the studio. And they work alongside the rest of the IATSE represented crafts, camera, editorial, art, etc., in pre-production, on-set, and in-post. Vendor-side workers are what most people outside of the industry often think of when they hear VFX workers. That is, they're employees of one of the hundreds of visual effects vendor houses, which employ teams of artists, production staff, programmers, producers, executives, in order to bid on and complete work being requested by a project. Now let's dig into some of the data points. I'm going to pass it off to Maggie, who's going to talk about healthcare and pension.
So members of IATSE represented departments who work directly with client-side visual effects workers for the same employers and in the same conditions have almost universally benefited for decades from inclusion in union negotiated healthcare coverage, such as those provided by the motion picture industry pension and health plans and the national benefit funds, or a comparable plan for those covered by DGA or WGA agreements. However, the breakdown we see here is stark. For client-side workers, only 12% responded that they have portable health care, with travels from job to job with them. The vast majority of these workers are on their own to pay for health care for themselves and their families, even if they are classified as full-time employees of a production company producing a film over the course of years. Vendor-side workers see little improvement on this, with only 25% saying they have a healthcare plan, which they can keep from job to job. Now, when I was working as an animator at the beginning of my career, I had full healthcare coverage that included vision and dental care provided by my employer. When I made the transition over into visual effects as a freelance artist in 2004, I had zero benefits offered to me, even though I was classified as a W-2 employee. When I attempted to apply for health care insurance for private healthcare, I was rejected for having the pre-existing condition of food poisoning. So for the first 10 years of my career, I worked without any coverage until the Affordable Care Act passed, which prohibited pre-existing condition exclusions for all plans. It was then when I finally saw a doctor who diagnosed me with a chronic disease that required surgery to cure. Even with private insurance, I postponed my treatment for another 5 years due to commitments to work, but also fully aware of the fact that visual effects workers don't have the added benefit of having paid sick leave. Eventually, I was forced to check into the ER when I collapsed at my desk while working and answering emails. My chronic disease that I had put off for so many years became gangrenous. I was literally rotting away at my desk just to deliver a show on time. So after 3 weeks of recovering from my surgery, the show had wrapped. I had no job to go back to, didn't qualify for unemployment since I had voluntarily left my job due to an illness, only to be stuck with mounting medical bills on top of the high monthly premiums I still had left to pay. So when we ask workers whether or not they feel their work in visual effects is sustainable long-term, the majority of respondents answered no and listed the lack of healthcare benefits as a major contributing factor to their burnout. As we saw with healthcare, the lack of employer-provided retirement benefits, a core component of IATSE negotiated agreements covering our coworkers, is apparent throughout the entire visual effects industry, but particularly on the client side. An overwhelming 85% of client-side visual effects crews indicated that they lacked any employer-funded retirement benefits, as well as a majority of vendor-side workers, about 53%. Considering visual effects is no longer an industry in its infancy, but instead relies upon the experience and knowledge of thousands of workers who've made a lifetime career in this field, the lack of any widespread retirement benefits contribute to the mental and physical costs associated with our work. This puts workers at an extreme disadvantage when they retire because not only do they have less resources available to them, but they are responsible for all their retirement contributions on their own with no help from their employer. Now, I am a second-generation pro-union supporter. My dad, an immigrant who worked in the hotel and restaurant industry for over 40 years, was a member of the Unite Here Local 6 union in New York City. I saw firsthand the positive impacts unions have made to secure workers' rights, workplace safety, and financial security in support of the average American working class family like mine. Thanks to the work and advocacy of labor unions, my dad was able to retire comfortably at 67 with not one but 2 pensions. As for myself, a person who has worked in visual effects for nearly 20 years, 30 years total in the film in general, I have been offered no pension, no retirement plan from companies I've worked consecutively for on projects that amount to 5+ years or so. Thankfully, I had the foresight and financial literacy to fund my own retirement plan, but I know plenty of workers now who aren't even considering retirement as a possibility for them, as most people, especially in LA, are still living paycheck to paycheck. Most visual effects workers I've known can barely survive more than 5 years in our industry. Without having the benefit of employer-sponsored plans like a pension or 401k, I don't see how a career in visual effects could be sustainable for the long term. For a single person, maybe, but if you want to raise a family, the odds are sadly against you. And I believe that we all know this industry is not too kind to families. And I will divert to Gabby, who will be talking about the lack of overtime protection.
Hey, so as discussed in the rates section, there is widespread prevalence of unpaid overtime, wage theft, which has been reported by a majority of client-side crews and a sizable portion of vendor-side workers. For the client side, 58% of respondents indicated that they had worked hours for their employer that they were not accurately compensated for. As an example, a data wrangler working for a flat rate would be assumed to be working 12 hours per day, and 12 hours is standard shoot day length, which is not inclusive of the hours of pre-call and post-wrap work that we are expected to complete each day in addition to our duties during the shoot call. I myself, and I know many of you, have work days where you're on set like 16 plus hours. And it's very hard to ignore how everyone but yourself is getting overtime. You just like watch your hourly rate shrink as you get no compensation after 12. It's not great. For some job titles, flat rate compensation has been so widespread and problematic that experienced workers are using the extreme demand for our labor to increase leverage in negotiations and secure hourly pay with overtime guarantees. Lead data wranglers, on-set supervisors, and VFX production artists are leading the way on this front. This still means negotiating each contract individually, which can happen 4 to 5 times a year, depending on the job length, leaving hourly pay up to chance and the personality of the producer. The majority of client-side workers without the benefit of wage transparency or a standardized contract are forced to take a weekly flat rate deal, which virtually guarantees they will be working for free at some point almost every single day in violation of the overtime protections in the Fair Labor Standards Act. As previously indicated, when discussing rates, vendor-side workers typically see slightly better protections from wage theft, though 39% still indicate they had worked hours for their employer without compensation. Our analysis indicates this is mostly due to some job titles, especially for workers in artistic roles, having hourly pay with overtime guarantees. Vendor-side production workers, such as coordinators, production managers, and assistants, reflect higher levels of weekly flat rate pay, which corresponds with a higher reporting of wage theft. As our attempt to capture a snapshot of the working conditions of VFX crews and how they compared to their coworkers and other private sector employees, we asked whether workers received what are known as meal penalties, which I'll explain, even though I'm sure many of you, or all of you, already know. It is a payment mandated by most collective bargaining agreements in entertainment work, which is given to a worker when they are, as is often the case, forced to work through legally mandated meal break times and rest periods. So over 80% of client-side workers said they received no compensation for being forced to work through through mandated break periods. And over 71% of vendor-side workers indicated the same thing. I've worked days where the first time we've broken for a meal is 10 hours in, it's wild. I've also asked for meal penalties on many of my contracts, and they're almost like summarily denied, just flat out, no negotiation. As with unpaid overtime, this amounts to wage theft, but also contributes to the structural challenges that VFX workers face, as they cannot even depend upon the basic protections under the law, the Division of Fair Labor Standards Act and child labor, which carve out periods for workers to rest, replenish their energy, and continue to operate efficiently and safely over the course of the 12 to 15-hour days, often 6 or 7 days a week for months on end. VFX workers on set are often told to use the lunch hour to capture set data and photograph props while the rest of the crew is breaking. And in post, the norm is to eat lunch at your desk while processing paperwork. Film crew workers on set and in post are given catered or takeout meals due to their inability to walk away to find food for themselves, but VFX crews often have to struggle to find time to order and pay for our own food, which contributes to a culture of overwork where asking for 30 minutes for lunch can be seen as a grave overreach by some producers or filmmakers, which, affects our safety standards. And on that note, I'd like to pass it off back to Mark to talk about safety.
Reasons we've broken down this data set into the client and vendor side workers is to call attention to the fact that in addition to the workers housed in vendor shops, there are currently hundreds of VFX crews working on sets across the world which lack the basic safety and training regulations, which the other crafts working alongside of us can rely on to ensure that workers feel safe on the job. So we asked workers like yourselves to rate their level of safety on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is workers' lives are in jeopardy, 5 is workers feel completely secure and protected. And so client-side workers who work with the shooting crews indicated far greater safety concerns, with the majority rating their safety at a middling 3. This is reflective of the lack of union-enforced safety standards for these employees. VFX workers on set are often tasked with capturing difficult and dangerous elements such as explosions, stunts, and going off on splinter unit duties, which can put them at higher risk than other departments. And additionally, without the benefit of a unit hotline or field agent who enforces safe conditions, these workers often have no recourse for lodging their complaints with anyone besides the producers who may have ordered them into these conditions in the first place. So this contributes to a culture of silence. As workers, we don't want to be seen as difficult, since every future job opportunity is based on personal relationships with these very producers. So, vendor side workers generally felt safer on the job, with the majority rating their safety as a 5, but then the next highest response was a 3, which indicates significant concerns that many vendor side workers feel about their protections. Many of these concerns are the same experienced by client-side workers who are engaged in a grueling post-production process, and responses centered on concerns about the extreme stress, the long hours, lack of healthcare and other benefits, and the perceived inability to file grievances when appropriate, which can contribute to unsafe conditions which may percolate until they result in tragedy. Right? We've all heard stories or even experienced ourselves, falling asleep at the wheel after weeks of near constant work, chronic mental and physical health issues, and pressures to keep silent about abuses and violations that we witness or are subjected to ourselves on the job. Right? This is not academic for me. I've experienced this. I've been sent out on splinter unit to an icebreaker off in Northern Europe in the sea to shoot remote controlled helicopters, to be comped into main unit photography. Of course, they were untested, and it turns out the torque on the engine was so strong that the rotors sheared themselves off and sent these 6-foot razor blades hurtling down at us. We had to duck and cover into shipping containers, which were fortunately on deck. So we all knew this was wrong and dangerous, but we're out there in splinter. We weren't even in the same country as main unit. We had no medic, safety officer, fire marshal, nothing. We had to literally call the director directly and leave it up to their judgment whether or not we kept going. Now, fortunately, they agreed to bring us in, but at that point, the seas were so high that our transit boat wasn't able to come alongside. So we ended up being trapped there for 15 hours waiting for rescue. And this was all, right, save money so we can fix it in post instead of using some real helicopters. So going hand in hand with our safety concerns as visual effects workers is the lack of VFX-specific resources provided by our employers to properly train and certify employees for their responsibilities. Now, again, there is a distinction between client-side workers working on a film crew and vendor-side workers working at an established visual effects house. So for client-side workers, only 25% indicated the availability of any training or educational resources for themselves or their coworkers. Considering the extremely high demand for visual effects crews currently, this has the effect in practice, I'm sure we're all aware, of ensuring that the crew members with previous experience will spend a significant portion of their time training newly hired green VFX workers while also having to complete their own massively expanded job duties. Every director, studio, and producer has different workflows and expectations. And so the lack of standardization across our industry means that workers often have to become experts, essentially overnight, in entirely new software packages, photographic capture tools, filmmaking workflows, and more, just depending on the preferences of our employers. Client-side workers often complain about having to reinvent the wheel on each new production. Whereas, organized departments like editorial and camera have a standard set of procedures and tools, which are coupled with educational training programs, which allow them to come to work ready to get the job done. So this is just one more structural hurdle that VFX workers must clear in order to work in a sane and sustainable manner. Vendor-side workers report much higher levels of training availability, but 39% still report they lack any resources for VFX-specific training or education. So sometimes these are longer-term employers housed in a more traditional workplace environment, or they're coming from an educational background focused on visual effects or digital art. So sometimes there's more clearly defined standards for software, hardware, job workflows, even a pipeline. But survey respondents do report that these companies are also notorious for their reticence to promote internally, with many vendor workers having to jump back and forth between visual effects companies in order to negotiate promotions or wage increases. And workers find the onus is on them to become proficient in newly developed software and workflows. And according to testimonies provided in the survey, those vendor employees seeking to move up within a company are often told to take on additional unpaid responsibilities, doing it for your real or working for the credit, in an attempt to demonstrate their proficiency and dedication to their employers. So let's get into the actual, industry wage distribution. And again, we've broken it down, client side and vendor side. Big takeaways from this section really is, right, we don't have any minimum wages set. There's no standard baseline rate. So we end up having a huge widespread rate, responses. And because of that, there's such a wide variation reflecting in the lack of transparency that currently exists about how much we can even demand for our time. And additionally, while we see from this client side and vendor side that sometimes client side workers can command higher rates for the vendor than the vendor side workers in terms of weekly pay, we also lack the relative stability and even sometimes the marginal benefits which can come from being employed by a large company. And we typically have to factor in weeks or months of annual unemployment when we wrap off a project. We can also see that, even on the client side, job titles like witness camera operator, VFX production assistant, junior data wranglers, these have rates which can sometimes amount to minimum wage or less when we're considering the unpaid overtime. Now, again, I've experienced this on almost every show. I'm sure you have too. Besides this survey that we've created ourselves, we have no transparency about what others in our positions get paid, or even a coworker sometimes working alongside of us for weeks or months or even years. I've been hired as a coordinator and forced to produce and supervise entire shows, and then been denied a raise even after having to crunch 36-hour days before screenings because, they can get away with paying me a PA rate, and they know that I have no recourse other than to quit. I've been asked to show my previous job's pay stubs during interviews, even after that practice was made illegal. So, what we're really talking about is just the knock-on effects of not having a voice in the job, not having any ability to negotiate for ourselves, and just ultimately being subject to the whims of our employer and producers based on what they feel like paying us. So let's ask the question then, are our jobs sustainable? Sean, would you like to take us through this?
Yeah, as I'm sure many of you on the call are listening to all of these data points and having either flashbacks to your own experience with them or experiences that you know of. The overall question was posed to our survey respondents of whether or not they considered their work in the visual effects industry sustainable in the long term. There was almost no difference in this question between vendor and client side answers. Nearly 2/3, 67% client side, 68% vendor side. Respondents answered that no, they didn't feel that their current work in the visual effects field was sustainable for them. When you consider the fact that nearly every major project currently in production is reliant on VFX heavy pipelines, that's features, television, streaming productions. And when you look at the box office returns for these things, whether or streaming numbers, the studios are very reliant on visual effects, and there's frequently more job openings than there are crew members to fill them. But when you couple that with the number of respondents who doubt their ability to continue this job long term, you start looking at something that should cause everyone concern, and as Mark mentioned, indicates an industry in crisis. Whether that's client side or vendor side, visual effects workers have been integral to generating the billions of dollars annually for the studios with their labor. And as we've seen in the other survey results, the overall structural conditions which prevail for these employees can contribute to massive rates of burnout. So we asked people, what would be your top priorities for improvement or change that would make your VFX work more sustainable? Nearly every respondent had multiple top priorities, many of which we've covered in the previous data points, but the top responses were respect and having a voice on the job, portable health care and benefits, pension, fair wages, work-life balance, including reasonable hours and turnaround restrictions, paid overtime, and job descriptions and training. The crazy part about all of those points is that they are things that have been addressed in every other collective bargaining agreement negotiated for every other craft that we work alongside at every step of the production process. So I know, at least for me, and I'm sure many of you have had the same experience, that you run into occasionally talking to other departments who are shocked to find out that visual effects is not unionized. You know, it's an industry where the vast majority of people working in it are represented by some sort of collective bargaining agreement, and visual effects, however, and everyone in it is not. So considering those points and the challenges faced by VFX workers, we have to ask what's to be done. We started by asking everyone, do you feel you have the ability as an individual to negotiate viable solutions that address those priorities that would change your work for the better? And nearly 9 out of 10 workers throughout the VFX industry answered no, they did not. That's an overwhelming majority of them that feel they have either no ability to negotiate for better conditions for themselves, or they are dependent upon individual agreements with studios, shows, or producers in order to get incremental improvements for each project. When you combine that with the nearly 70% of people in VFX who don't feel it's sustainable long term, then the crisis that we outlined comes into sharp focus. You know, visual effects workers don't feel that they can individually change things, and they don't feel that the current situation is sustainable for them in the long term. It has fostered an overwhelming environment of feeling like visual effects work is being treated as second-class citizens that are excluded from the protections and benefits that all of the coworkers around them on a film set depend on a day-to-day basis. The data from this survey supports the idea that their concerns are merited and suggests that only through collective bargaining can these shared priorities be comprehensively addressed, which nicely segues us into call to action from Mark.
The numbers don't lie. But the fact that VFX workers are harmed daily because we lack a collective voice on the job is not new, and it's not enough to affect the change that we need across this industry. The only thing that can create transformative and sustainable change to this structure that affects us all is if we, as those who are directly impacted, actively organize our fellow coworkers. All right, so as we mentioned at the top, we're going to take this moment now to transition from protesting these conditions to taking focused collective action to gain real power by winning our VFX union with IATSE in 2023. We're asking you to join us. Ben is going to tell us now how.
Well, with those powerful words and the presentation you just had, many of y'all are sitting here, as Sean said, you know, these are things that you've lived, you've experienced. We've told the world, There's abuses impacting VFX workers across the industry every day, and we've been telling the world for some time about that. As Mark just said, there are things you can do right now to help build this movement so that we're successful at establishing the first VFX union amongst all of these job titles, and we're winning union recognition in 2023. If you want to see that happen, if you are here because you are committed to seeing it happen, here are a few steps you can take right now to help make it happen. If you're currently working in VFX, you can reach out to us at vfx@iatsc.net, and to Mark and I at Mark's email address is mpatch@iatsc.net, and mine is bspate@iatsc.net. If you're currently working in VFX, whether it's on a major production and at a major studio, or you're working at a large vendor operation, wherever you're working, you can start right now by collecting a contact information sheet of all the coworkers that you work with. Collect their non-work contact information, identify their names and job titles, and by building that list, you will start to populate a community of those that could be eligible in a future union election. We can't move forward in an organizing effort unless we know who could possibly be eligible to vote. So building a complete list of all current VFX workers for each major studio that you're working at and at vendor operations as well, sending that information to Mark and I and to the advisory council members that are here. Number two, you can work to recruit a group of your coworkers, a core group of current employees at that particular studio or vendor operation. That group would be composed of people that are the most supportive of organizing at that particular employer, at that particular studio. That core group would meet with Mark and I and come up with an employer-specific plan that would entail outreach to the remaining coworkers at that particular employer. Start with the list, build a comprehensive list, have a core group that is working that list to do what? To conduct outreach. Step number 3, conduct outreach of all of your coworkers at that particular employer. Our goal is going to be 80% support across all VFX job titles at each particular studio and vendor employer. 4, once you have your core group who is building and reviewing the list and updating that complete list of your coworkers, you're meeting regularly. Now you're doing outreach to your coworkers. You're meeting with them one-on-one. You're determining their support for the union. You make a commitment with them, with each of your coworkers, to sign yes, to vote for your VFX union by signing authorization cards with the IATSE. That is a process that will come about after they have committed to voting yes by a supermajority of 80%. Once we sign cards to demand our union, then we can make an announcement publicly to urge our employers to do the right thing and agree to voluntary union recognition. If they choose not to agree to voluntary union recognition, we will file a petition with the National Labor Relations Board using those authorization cards and hold a secret ballot election, which will be held around 30 to 45 days from the time we make our demand for union recognition. Then once we go public with our demand for union recognition is our time for VFX workers throughout the industry and our IATSE allies to stand in solidarity with our demand for recognition. At that time, we will be prepared to take appropriate collective action to win union recognition and to inspire others at other employers and other studios to come together and organize as well. If we do all those things, y'all, in 2023, we will be able to complete this final step of beginning negotiations for the first VFX union contract in history. Let's make that happen. You can get involved right now. And for additional help, the Advisory Council and Mark are going to review some next steps that you can take today.
Right. So what can you do right now coming out of this meeting? All right. If you haven't talked to us yet, contact us. Like we said, vfx@iatsc.net, mpatch@iatsc.net, bspate@iatsc.net. Set up a time to talk with us about your ideas and your capacity to get involved. And that contact information is also available right on our website, vfxunion.org, along with this report that we just went through. As you can see the results of this survey. Maggie, do you want to talk about our next step?
Number one is to collect contact information for anyone currently working at major studios and strategic vendors. Send it to organizers like us. And Gabby?
The next step is to volunteer to support VFX organizing at any studio. Join the IATSE VFX Organizing Campaign Advisory Council, all of us. And we meet every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific. The next step for Sean.
Yeah, and the next step, and this is the real groundwork one, is coordinate organizing your current employer. You have to talk to people, and that's setting up initial small group meetings of people that are most interested in it. That's performing the outreach among the crew list that you have built. And that is generally just talking to everybody that you can and need to in order to assess support for unionization. And it's also important to remember, and this is something that I don't think has been mentioned yet, but just in case it was, talking about a union is a protected action in the United States. The National Labor Relations Board protects the forming of a labor union or assisting in the formation of a labor union. It is not something that, I'm not going to say that people can't retaliate for it, but it's illegal to do so. So, it's a difficult step because you are putting yourself out there to talk about something that not everybody may be in support of, but it is your right as employees. And it is something that, this is a cause that you want to affect to see change. It needs to be the next step. And that leads us right back to Mark to wrap it all up nicely.
Right. And then, that might sound like a lot to you, but what we always say is you don't need to be an expert organizer. You just need your empathy and your knowledge of your craft. And everyone here showing up, giving up this hour of time on your Sunday to show up here in support of your coworkers has already demonstrated that, right? So we are here. We will be available to help support you, to train you, to have these conversations with your coworkers, to help organize this information, to answer your questions, to educate you and your coworkers about your rights, as Sean mentioned, under the National Labor Relations Act. And then we ask you to commit to consistently support this campaign until we win. And everything we have talked about today, every part of our strategy is focused on winning in 2023. We are not here to protest or shame people into giving us a union. We're here to win it for ourselves. And that's why we've taken this time and put in these months of work. And I just want to lift up the advisory council who's sitting here today, who's been working on y'all's behalf, trying to win us a union. And we ask you to join us.